In the scorching heat of July 1888, a scream rang out across the terrified town of Silver Creek, Wyoming, that stopped every heart in the valley. When the young widow Abigail Coulter shrieked, "You want to put it in," at the town's wealthiest, most dangerous rancher, the locals feared a violent assault. But what Jedediah Rourke actually did next was far more shocking than any scandal. His action that afternoon didn't just break a heart. It broke a 50-year-old treaty and ignited a war that would turn neighbor against neighbor. This is the true untold story of the Silver Creek feud. The Wyoming wind didn't just blow in Silver Creek. It scoured. It stripped the paint off the siding of the church and sanded the hope right out of the people. For Abigail Coulter, the wind was just one more thing trying to take the Coulter ranch away from her. At 26, Abby was already a widow of 3 years. Her husband Samuel had died trying to save a calf in a flash flood, leaving her with 2,000 acres of scrub grass, a mountain of debt, and a fierce, stubborn pride that the local bankers found exhausting. She stood on the porch of the homestead, wiping her hands on a stained apron. The sun was beating down on the cracked earth of the yard. She watched the dust cloud rising in the distance, signaling a rider. She knew the horse. It was a massive black stallion, an expensive beast that looked fed and watered better than most of the town's children. That horse belonged to Jedediah Rourke. Even the mention of his name made the locals of Silver Creek spit on the ground. Rourke wasn't from around there. He had come from the East Chicago, some said, or maybe Boston, with a carpetbag full of money and eyes as cold as a frozen creek. In 2 years, he had bought out the Millers, the Hendersons, and Old Man Galloway. He was consolidating the valley, turning family farms into a massive beef empire. He didn't ranch like a neighbor. He ranched like a general conquering territory. Abby smoothed her hair, though she knew it was futile against the wind. She reached inside the door and grabbed the double-barreled shotgun leaning against the frame. She didn't aim it, just broke it open to check the shells and snapped it shut with a loud clack that carried across the yard. Jedediah rode up to the fence line, stopping 10 yards short of the porch. He was a hard man to look at, not because he was ugly, in fact. With his sharp jawline, dark stubble, and piercing blue eyes, he was aggravatingly handsome, but because he looked like trouble wrapped in expensive linen. He wore a black Stetson and a vest that cost more than Abby's projected earnings for the year. "Mrs. Coulter." He nodded, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the dry air. "Rourke," Abby replied, keeping the gun cradled in her elbow. "If you're here to make another offer on the land, you can turn that expensive horse around. My answer is the same as last week." "No." Jedediah shifted in his saddle leather, creaking. "I'm not here to make an offer, Abigail. I'm here to give you a warning. I don't need warnings from land sharks." "The bank in Cheyenne sold your note this morning," Jedediah said flatly. "To me." The air left Abby's lungs. The promissory note. Samuel had taken it out to build the new barn right before he died. "That's a lie. Mr. Sterling at the bank said I had until the harvest." Sterling was over-leveraged. He folded. I bought his portfolio. Jedediah leaned forward, resting his hands on the saddle horn. "Technically, I own this porch you're standing on. But I'm not a monster despite what the sewing circle says about me. I'm giving you a choice." Abby felt the heat rising in her neck, a mix of shame and fury. "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity. It's business. I need access to the North Creek. Your property blocks the only viable path for the irrigation channel I'm digging. I don't want your house. I don't want your cattle. I just want the easement." The North Creek. Abby stepped off the porch, forgetting the gun for a moment. That creek feeds the town reservoir. If you divert it for your herd, the town wells will go dry by August. Jedediah's expression didn't change. The town should have thought of that before they refused to sell me the rights to the lower valley. I have 3,000 head of cattle arriving in a week. They need water. You'd dry out an entire town for your cows. My cows are worth more than this town, he said coldly. I'm coming tomorrow with the surveyor to place the markers. Do not interfere, Mrs. Coulter. If you do, I'll foreclose on this ranch before the sun sets. He tipped his hat, spun the stallion around, and galloped away, leaving Abby choking in his dust. She gripped the shotgun until her knuckles turned white. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a predator, and he had just backed her into a corner. But Abigail Coulter had never been good at staying in corners. The next morning, the heat was oppressive, a physical weight pressing down on the valley. By noon, the temperature was pushing 100 degrees. Abby had ridden out to the North Creek early. The creek was the lifeline of the property, a bubbling flow of snowmelt coming down from the peaks. It wound through a grove of cottonwoods, the only shade for miles. It was also sacred ground. Under the largest cottonwood lay 2 simple stone markers, one for Samuel and one for their infant daughter Sarah, who had lived only 3 days. She heard the wagon before she saw it. The clattering of wheels over rocky ground signaled the arrival of Jedediah Rourke and his crew. He brought 3 men with him, 2 burly ranch hands and a thin, nervous-looking man in a suit holding a tripod, the surveyor. Abby stood directly in the path of the wagon, her horse shifting nervously beneath her. She wasn't armed this time. She knew shooting Rourke would only land her in a cell, but she was armed with something she hoped was stronger, the law of the range. "You can't do this," she shouted as they pulled up. Jedediah jumped down from the wagon. He was in his shirt sleeves today, sweat dampening the back of his linen shirt. He ignored her, gesturing to the surveyor. "Set the line here, straight through the grove to the ridge." The surveyor looked nervously at Abby, then at the grove of trees. "Mr. Rourke, that goes right through the graves." Abby's heart stopped. She spurred her horse forward, blocking the surveyor. "You will not touch those trees. My husband is buried there. My baby is buried there." Jedediah walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed. Abigail moved the horse. The gradient only works through the grove. It's engineering, not sentiment. Sentiment. She slid off her horse, landing in the dirt with a thud, marching up to him. She was a foot shorter than him, but in that moment she felt 10 feet tall. "That isn't sentiment. That is consecrated ground. You move that line 10 yards to the east. 10 yards east is bedrock." Jedediah snapped, his patience fraying. "I'd have to blast. I don't have time to blast. The cattle are coming." He grabbed a heavy iron stake from the back of the wagon. It was 4 feet long, sharp at one end, painted bright red at the top. It was the marker for the center of the new irrigation trench. He walked past her, heading straight for the soft earth between the 2 headstones. "Don't you dare," she warned, her voice trembling. He positioned the tip of the iron stake into the soil right at the foot of Samuel's grave. He raised a heavy sledgehammer. This was the moment. The heat, the grief, the fear of losing her home, it all boiled over. "You want to put it in?" she screamed, her voice cracking, echoing off the canyon walls. Right there. Over their bodies. The surveyor flinched. The 2 ranch hands looked away, ashamed. Jedediah paused, the hammer raised high. He looked at the grave markers. He looked at Abby's face streaked with dust and tears. For a second, she thought she saw a flicker of hesitation, a crack in the armor of the ruthless businessman. "I have to, Abigail," he said softly. "If you drive that stake," she hissed, "you aren't just a rancher. You're a devil." Jedediah's jaw tightened. The softness vanished. He swung the hammer. Clang! The sound of metal on metal was sickening. He drove the stake deep into the earth, mere inches from the headstone of her husband. He swung again and again. With each strike, he wasn't just marking land, he was severing his connection to humanity in her eyes. "Dig it," Jedediah ordered his men, his voice devoid of emotion. "Cut the channel right through here." He turned his back on her screaming protests and walked back to the wagon. By the time the sun went down, the news had reached town. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, who had been delivering mail to the surveyor, had seen the whole thing. She rode her mule back to Silver Creek so fast the poor beast nearly collapsed. She burst into the Golden Nugget Saloon, where half the town's men were cooling off with lukewarm beer. "He did it!" Mrs. Gable shrieked, gasping for air. "That devil Rourke," Abby screamed at him, begged him. She asked him if he really wanted to put it in right there on the graves. And he did it. He drove a spike right through Samuel Coulter's resting place. The silence in the saloon was heavy. Men set down their glasses. Sheriff Elias Cobb, a man who had been trying to keep the peace between the old families and the new money, stood up slowly from his corner table. "He desecrated the grave," Cobb asked, his voice low. "Right through the heart of the plot." Mrs. Gable embellished, wiping her face. "To steal the water for his cows." A low murmur of rage rippled through the room. In the West, you could steal a man's horse and maybe get a trial. You could cheat at cards and maybe get a punch. But you didn't mess with a man's water, and you certainly didn't disrespect the dead. "That's it," shouted Jeremiah Holt, the blacksmith. He grabbed a hammer from his belt. "I've had enough of Rourke treating this town like his personal outhouse. Who's with me?" Chairs scraped against the floorboards. One by one, the men of Silver Creek stood up. They weren't a lynch mob yet, but they were close. They were a tide of angry, dusty men, tired of being pushed around by a man in a silk vest. Abigail Coulter had screamed in desperation, but she had inadvertently sounded a war horn. The outrage didn't just ripple, it exploded. And as the sun set over the purple mountains, a dozen torches were lit on Main Street. They were heading to the Coulter Ranch, not to hurt Abby, but to tear down that fence, pull up that stake, and perhaps burn Jedediah Rourke out of the valley once and for all. Night didn't bring relief to Silver Creek. It only brought shadows. The heat of the day radiated up from the baked earth, creating a suffocating atmosphere that smelled of dry sage and impending violence. Abigail Coulter sat on her porch swing, but she wasn't swinging. Her shotgun lay across her lap, the metal barrel warm to the touch. The surveyor and his team had retreated to their tents near the creek, but Jedediah Rourke hadn't left. He had set up a camp chair right next to that hateful iron stake, lighting a cigar, as if daring the ghosts of the cemetery to come out and challenge him. Abby watched the orange ember of his cigar glowing in the darkness of the cottonwood grove a quarter-mile away. It looked like a demon's eye. "Stubborn fool," she whispered to herself. "He thinks money can stop a bullet." Then she saw the lights. At first, they looked like fireflies dancing on the horizon of the main road. But fireflies didn't move in a rigid column, and they didn't roar. The sound of shouting men, the tramping of hooves, and the rattle of wagon wheels drifted on the wind. The town was coming. Abby's stomach twisted. She wanted Rourke gone. She wanted him humiliated. But she knew the men of Silver Creek. They were good men when sober, but tonight, fueled by Mrs. Gable's stories and cheap whiskey, they were a force of nature. If they found Rourke alone in that grove, they wouldn't just talk. They would hang him. And if they hanged a man on her land, right over Samuel's grave, the Coulter Ranch would be cursed forever. She grabbed the shotgun and ran for the barn, throwing a saddle onto her mare with trembling hands. She galloped toward the creek, the horse's hooves thundering against the hardpack. As she burst into the grove, Jedediah was already standing. He had heard them, too. He kicked dirt over his small campfire, plunging the grove into darkness, save for the moonlight filtering through the leaves. He held a Winchester rifle loosely in one hand, looking more annoyed than afraid. "Go back to the house, Abigail," he said, his voice calm. "They're coming for you, Rourke," she hissed, reining in the dancing mare. "Sheriff Cobb, Jeremiah Holt, half the town. You need to ride out, now, heading toward the ridge. And leave my equipment, my stake." He shook his head. "I don't run from mobs, especially not on land I legally control." "You don't understand," Abby shouted, pointing toward the approaching line of torches that were now illuminating the fence line. "They think you desecrated the dead. They aren't coming to serve papers. I didn't desecrate anything. I placed a marker. Tell that to the drunk blacksmith with a hammer." Before he could argue further, the mob crested the small hill leading down to the creek. There were at least 30 of them. Torches sputtered, casting wild, dancing shadows against the white bark of the cottonwoods. The light illuminated the anger on their faces. Jeremiah Holt was in the lead, his face red and sweating, a heavy sledgehammer resting on his shoulder. Sheriff Cobb rode beside him, looking pale and reluctant. "Rourke!" Holt bellowed. "Come out, you grave-robbing son of a bitch!" Jedediah stepped out from behind the trunk of the massive cottonwood directly over Samuel's grave. He levered around into his rifle, the click-clack distinct and loud. "I'm right here, Holt. You're trespassing." "Trespassing?" Holt laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "We're here to clean up the trash. You drive a spike into a good man's grave, you forfeit your rights." "The stake is necessary," Jedediah said, his voice cutting through the noise. "It marks the gradient. Move it, and the water won't flow." "We don't care about your water," shouted a voice from the back. It was Silas, the owner of the general store. "We care about respect." Someone threw a rock. It struck Jedediah in the shoulder, dusting his fine vest with dirt. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his rifle. He just stared them down with those icy blue eyes. "String him up!" a voice cried. The mob surged forward. Sheriff Cobb tried to cut his horse in front of them. "Now hold on, boys. We aren't hanging anyone. We're just going to escort him to the county line." "He's too rich for the law, Sheriff," Holt yelled, shoving Cobb's horse aside. "He bought the bank. He bought the judge. He ain't buying us." Holt lunged at Jedediah. Jedediah swung the butt of his rifle, catching Holt in the jaw, sending the big blacksmith stumbling back. But 3 other men tackled Jedediah. The rifle flew into the brush. They wrestled him to the ground, kicking and punching. The expensive linen shirt tore. Dust and blood mixed on his face. "Stop it!" Abby screamed. She fired both barrels of her shotgun into the air. Boom, boom. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed grove. Leaves rained down. The men froze, looking up at Abby, who sat high on her horse, smoke curling from the barrel of her weapon. "Get off him!" she commanded, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "Abby, stay out of this!" Holt spat, wiping blood from his lip. We're doing this for you, for Samuel, for Samuel." Abby dropped from her horse, using the empty shotgun as a club to push her way through the circle of men. She stood over Jedediah, who was pushing himself up on one elbow, gasping for breath, blood trickling from his nose. "You think Samuel would want this?" Abby glared at her neighbors. "You think he'd want a murder committed on top of him? You think he'd want his wife to watch a lynching?" "He ain't no man, Abby," Silas yelled. "He's a vulture." "He's a human being," Abby cried, surprising herself. She looked down at Jedediah. Up close, stripped of his arrogance and his pristine clothes, he looked mortal. He looked hurt. And he's right. He owns the note. He owns the rights. If you kill him, the marshals will burn this whole town down. Do you want that for your children?" The men shuffled. The logic pierced through the whiskey haze. Killing a wealthy man from the east wasn't like stringing up a horse thief. It brought the federal government. "He pulls the stake," Holt growled, pointing a shaking finger. "He pulls it out now, and we leave him be." Abby turned to Jedediah. "Pull it." Jedediah wiped the blood from his mouth. He looked at the stake driven deep into the soil near the headstone. He looked at the angry faces. He looked at Abby, her eyes pleading. Slowly, painfully, he got to his feet. He walked over to the iron rod. He gripped it with both hands. His knuckles turned white. With a grunt of exertion, he wrenched it from the earth. He tossed the red-painted iron onto the ground at Holt's feet. "There," Jedediah rasped. "You have your victory." The tension broke. The men grumbled, some spitting on the ground near Rourke's boots, but the violence had evaporated. They began to disperse, drifting back toward their horses, the fire in their bellies doused by the reality of what they almost did. Sheriff Cobb tipped his hat to Abby. "I'll make sure they get home, Mrs. Coulter. Sorry for the trouble." Within 10 minutes, the grove was silent again. Only Abby and Jedediah remained. Jedediah leaned against the cottonwood, clutching his ribs. He looked terrible. His left eye was swelling shut, and his shirt was in tatters. "You didn't have to save me," he said, wincing as he straightened up. "I didn't save you," Abby replied, reloading her shotgun with trembling fingers. "I saved my land from being a crime scene." "Is that all it was?" Abby looked at him. The moonlight softened the hard angles of his face. "Why did you do it, Rourke? Why are you so desperate for this water that you'd risk your life against a mob?" Jedediah sighed, sliding down the tree trunk to sit on the ground. He looked defeated. "It's not just the water, Abigail. It's the time. Time. I have a contract with the army. Beef for the reservations and the forts up north. If I don't deliver 3,000 head, fattened and healthy by October the 1st, I lose everything. My investors will pull out. I'll be destitute." He laughed bitterly. "You think I'm a king, but I'm just a man standing on a house of cards. That water, without it the herd won't make weight. I'll fail." Abby stared at him. The great Jedediah Rourke, the monster of Silver Creek, was just as desperate as she was. He was just broke on a larger scale. "You could have asked," she said softly, "instead of demanding." "I don't know how to ask," he admitted, looking up at her. "I've never had to." Abby felt a strange pang in her chest. It wasn't quite sympathy, but it was close. "Can you ride?" "I think so." "Go back to your ranch, Rourke. Clean yourself up. We'll talk tomorrow. About the easement. About everything." She watched him mount his black stallion, wincing with every movement. As he rode away into the darkness, Abby touched the cold stone of Samuel's grave. "I'm sorry, Sam," she whispered, "but I think the war just changed." The scandal of the graveyard riot, as the town paper dubbed it, did not blow over. If anything, it festered. The townspeople felt foolish for backing down, and their embarrassment turned into a cold, hard resentment toward the one person they felt had betrayed them, Abigail Coulter. When Abby went into town 2 days later to buy flour, the silence was deafening. Mrs. Gable closed the post office window when she saw Abby coming. Silas at the general store took her money, but didn't look her in the eye, slamming the bag of flour on the counter with unnecessary force. "Traitor," someone whispered as she walked out. Abby held her head high, but the sting brought tears to her eyes as she rode the wagon back home. They didn't understand. They didn't know about the debt or the fact that Rourke held the power to evict her with a snap of his fingers. They only saw her defending the enemy. She arrived back at the ranch to find a buggy parked in front of her house. It was a sleek black carriage with gold trim Rourke's carriage. Jedediah was sitting on her porch again, but this time the dynamic was different. He was dressed in a fresh charcoal suit, his face bruised and purple around the eye, a cut on his lip stitched closed. He looked battered but dignified. He stood when she approached. "They weren't kind to you in town," he stated. It wasn't a question. He had likely heard the reports. "I don't need them to be kind. I need them to buy my hay, and it looks like they won't be doing that anymore." Abby dropped the flour onto the porch swing. "What do you want, Jedediah?" "You pulled the stake. Isn't that enough?" "I pulled the stake, but the problem remains. I need the water. You need money. And now we both have a reputation problem. I have a reputation problem because of you." "True," he conceded. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the dry fields. "I've been looking at your books, Abigail. The bank records. You have no right. I have every right. I own the bank." He turned to face her. "You're drowning. Even with a good harvest, you can't pay the principal on Samuel's loan. I can foreclose on you tomorrow. Legally, I should." Abby felt the cold dread wash over her. "So that's it. You came to tell me to pack." "No. I came to make you a proposition." He stepped closer. The scent of expensive bay rum and tobacco hung around him. The bruising on his face made him look dangerous, rugged. "I need that water easement, but I also need something else. My investors, the men back east, they are getting nervous about the Wild West stories they hear. Stories about riots and range wars. They want stability. They want to know I'm not just a carpetbagger raiding the land." He paused, taking a breath. "I need to settle down. I need to appear rooted in the community. I need to marry." Abby laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "Well, good luck finding a bride in Silver Creek. They think you're the Antichrist. I don't want a bride from Silver Creek." Jedediah said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I want you." The world seemed to stop spinning. The wind died down. The only sound was the beating of Abby's heart in her ears. "Me," she whispered. "You must be concussed." "Think about it, Abigail. It's a business arrangement. A merger. You marry me, and your debt is wiped clean. The Coulter Ranch remains yours in name and deed. I get the water rights I need without a war. You get the financial security to run this place however you see fit. And the town, well, they can't hate you more than they already do. But they will fear you, and they will respect the Rourke money." "You want to buy me?" she said, her voice shaking with anger, like a cow. "No, I want to partner with you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. "This is a prenuptial agreement. It states that in the event of a dissolution, the Coulter land reverts to you debt-free. I'm not trying to trap you, Abigail. I'm trying to save us both." Abby looked at the paper. It was freedom. It was the salvation of her heritage, her home, Samuel's legacy. All she had to do was marry the man who had threatened to destroy it all. "And what about us?" she asked, her face flushing. "Is this a real marriage, or just on paper?" Jedediah's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The heat between them flared sudden and intense. "That," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "would be entirely up to you." Abby turned away, walking to the railing. She looked out at the cottonwood grove at the hidden graves. Samuel would hate this. He would hate Rourke. But Samuel had also died trying to save a calf worth $10. He was a practical man. He would hate for her to starve for the sake of pride. She turned back to Jedediah. "If I do this," she said, "there are rules. You don't touch the grove, you don't fire my hands, and you sleep in the guest room until I say otherwise." Jedediah smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had seen on him. It transformed his face, making him look younger, less like a tycoon, and more like a man. "Agreed. Then you have a deal, Mr. Rourke. Call me Jedediah. We'll see." The wedding was set for 3 days later. It was a scandal that eclipsed the riot. The town was in an uproar. Abigail Coulter marrying the devil Rourke. It was betrayal. It was heresy. They were married by a circuit judge in the parlor of the Coulter ranch house. No guests. Just the lawyer, the judge, and the witnesses. As Jedediah slid the heavy gold ring onto her finger, Abby felt the weight of it. It felt like a shackle. But as she looked up into his bruised face, she saw something else in his eyes. It wasn't triumph. It was relief, and perhaps a spark of admiration. But the town wasn't done with them yet. That night, as Abby sat in her bedroom listening to the boots of her new husband pacing in the hall, she heard a sound outside. Not a mob this time. It was the sound of a single gunshot, followed by the roar of flames. She ran to the window. The barn, the new barn Samuel had built, the reason for the debt, was ablaze. The feud hadn't ended with the wedding. It had just turned deadly. And as Abby watched the flames lick the night sky, she realized that marrying Jedediah Rourke hadn't bought her safety. It had painted a target on her back. The flames roared like a living beast consuming the dry timber of the barn with terrifying speed. The heat was intense enough to blister skin from 20 yards away. "The horses!" Abby screamed, sprinting toward the inferno. "Star and Comanche are in there. Stay back!" Jedediah grabbed her arm, jerking her away as a burning beam crashed down in front of the stable doors. "It's too hot, Abigail. You can't go in there. Let me go." She fought against his grip, tears streaming down her face. "That's all I have left of him." Jedediah looked at her wild eyes, then at the wall of fire. He shoved her backward toward the water trough. "Stay here, douse yourself if the wind shifts." Before she could protest, Jedediah pulled his coat over his head and ran straight into the smoke. "Jedediah!" she shrieked. The next few minutes stretched into an eternity. The roof of the barn groaned, sagging inward. Sparks spiraled into the night sky like angry fireflies. Abby stood paralyzed, the heat searing her face, her hands clasped over her mouth. If he died in there, if she lost 2 husbands to this cursed land. A dark shape burst through the wall of smoke. It was Star, the old mare, galloping frantically into the night. Following close behind was Comanche Samuel's prize roan with Jedediah clinging to its mane. He slid off the horse as they cleared the danger zone, collapsing onto the dirt, coughing violently. Abby ran to him. He was covered in soot, his fine wedding suit ruined, holes burned through the sleeves. He was gasping for air, retching from the smoke inhalation. "You idiot!" Abby cried, dropping to her knees beside him. She grabbed a bucket of water from the trough and splashed it over his head. "You could have died." Jedediah wiped the wet soot from his eyes, grimacing. "You said, 'Don't touch the grove.'" He wheezed, a crooked, pained grin breaking through the grime. "You didn't say anything about the barn." Abby looked at him, really looked at him. His hands were blistered, his eyebrows were singed. He had run into fire for horses that weren't his for a woman who had held a shotgun on him days before. "Come on," she said, her voice softer than it had ever been. "Let's get you inside." Inside the ranch house, the air was still and cool, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Abby led him to the kitchen, sitting him down on a wooden chair. She lit a kerosene lamp and fetched her medical kit, a tin box filled with salves and bandages. "Take off your shirt," she ordered. Jedediah hissed as he peeled the fabric away from his skin. His left arm was angry red, blistered from shoulder to elbow. His back was scourged with scratches from the debris. Abby worked in silence, applying a cooling salve made of aloe and herbs. Her fingers were gentle, tracing the hard muscles of his back. For the first time, she noticed the scars he already carried. There was a jagged white line across his ribs, a knife wound, and a round, puckered scar on his shoulder, a bullet hole. "Chicago looks like a rough town," she murmured, wrapping a clean linen bandage around his arm. "It wasn't Chicago," Jedediah said, his voice low. He was watching her hands. "It was the war, and then the railroad camps. You don't build an empire without bleeding Abigail." "Is that what this is, an empire?" "It was supposed to be." He looked around the modest kitchen. "Now it's just a fight for survival." Abby tied off the bandage. She was standing between his knees, close enough to smell the smoke and the sweat on him. The tension in the room shifted. The adrenaline of the fire was fading, replaced by a heavy, palpable awareness of each other. They were married, alone, in a house isolated by miles of darkness. Jedediah looked up at her. His blue eyes were dark, dilated. He reached out with his uninjured hand and brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. His thumb lingered on her jawline. "Thank you," he whispered, "for patching me up." Abby's breath hitched. She should step back. She should remind him of the guest room rule. But her feet wouldn't move. "You saved the horses, Jedediah. You didn't have to." "I told you," he said, his voice rough. "I take care of what's mine." "Is that what I am? Yours?" "On paper," he murmured, leaning in slightly. "But I'm beginning to wish the paper wasn't the only thing binding us." He was going to kiss her. She knew it. And God help her, she wanted him to. The anger, the fear, the confusion, it all coalesced into a desperate need for connection. But then a loud banging on the front door shattered the moment. "Open up, Sheriff's Department!" Abby jumped back as if scalded. Jedediah's eyes instantly hardened, the vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of cold fury. He stood up, grabbing his ruined shirt to cover himself, and marched to the door. Sheriff Cobb stood on the porch, flanked by 2 deputies. They looked uncomfortable. "Little late for a social call, Cobb," Jedediah growled. "Saw the fire from the ridge," Cobb said, peering past Jedediah at Abby. "Looks like bad luck struck the Coulter place again." "Bad luck doesn't smell like kerosene," Jedediah snapped. "Someone doused the perimeter. I found the can." "Is that so?" Cobb scratched his chin. Well, with all this heat. Dry wood. Spontaneous combustion happens, Mr. Rourke. Spontaneous combustion. Abby stepped forward, outraged. Sheriff, it rained 2 days ago. That wood was seasoned. Someone set this fire. Now, Mrs. Rourke, Cobb said, using her new name with a sneer that made Abby flinch. I know emotions are high, but unless you saw someone, it's just speculation. Town's pretty angry about the wedding. Could be kids pranking. Pranking? Jedediah stepped out onto the porch, towering over the sheriff. This is arson. It's a felony. And if you won't investigate, I'll bring in the Pinkertons from Denver. Cobb's eyes narrowed. You bring Private Dix into my town, Rourke, and you'll find the law is a lot less friendly. You two be careful. Accidents happen out here. The sheriff turned and walked away, leaving a clear threat hanging in the air. Jedediah slammed the door and locked it. He turned to Abby, his face pale with rage. It's not just the town, he said. Cobb is bought. Bought by who? My competitors, the Beef Trust in Chicago. They knew I was vulnerable on this contract. They're paying someone locally to squeeze me out. He paced the kitchen. The fire was a distraction. They want to panic us. Panic us from what? The herd, Jedediah said, stopping dead. The cattle are crossing the pass tomorrow. If they can't burn me out, they'll stop the herd. If those cows don't reach the railhead, I'm bankrupt. And if I'm bankrupt, they take the land. He looked at Abby. I have to ride out at dawn. I have to meet the foreman. You can't ride with that arm, Abby said firmly. You can barely hold a rein. I don't have a choice. Yes, you do. Abby walked over to the gun rack and pulled down her Winchester. She checked the lever action with a practiced hand. I'm going with you. Abigail, no. It's too dangerous. It's my land they're trying to steal, Jedediah. It's my husband they just tried to burn. She met his gaze, her chin high. And I know the pass better than you. If there's an ambush waiting, you'll ride right into it. I can get us around it. Jedediah looked at her for a long moment. He saw the steel in her spine that matched his own. He nodded once. We ride at first light. The dawn broke grey and sullen, the sun hidden behind a bank of clouds that promised a storm. Abby and Jedediah rode in silence, pushing their horses hard toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Range. The pain in Jedediah's arm was evident. He held it stiffly against his side, but he didn't complain. He rode with a grim determination that Abby found herself admiring. He wasn't a soft city man. He was iron. They reached the high pass by noon. Below them lay the winding trail, where Jedediah's herd, 3,000 head of longhorns, was slowly snaking its way toward the valley. The sound of the cattle, a low, constant moaning, drifted up on the wind. They're late, Jedediah said, scanning the trail with binoculars. My foreman Dutch should have had them at the Narrows by now. The Narrows? Abby frowned. That's a choke point. High canyon walls on both sides. If the river is high... She stopped. She looked at the river flowing through the canyon. It was a muddy trickle. The water, she whispered. Look at the water level. Jedediah adjusted the binoculars. It's down. Way down. Someone dammed it upstream, Abby said, a cold realization hitting her. They aren't just trying to stop the herd. They're trying to kill it. Without water in the Narrows, those cattle will panic. They'll stampede. We have to get to Dutch, Jedediah said, spurring his horse. They scrambled down the rocky slope, sliding through shale and scrub brush. As they hit the valley floor, the smell of dust and animal sweat was overwhelming. They found the herd stalled a mile before the narrows. The cowboys were shouting, trying to keep the thirsty animals from scattering. Dutch, a weathered man with a white moustache, rode up to them. He looked relieved to see Jedediah, but his face was grave. "Boss, thank God. We got trouble. The creek is dry. The cows are smelling water up the ridge, but we can't get 'em there. They're getting spooky." "It's a damn Dutch," Jedediah said. "Someone blocked the flow." "We need to break that dam," Abby said, pointing to the cliffs above. "If we don't get water flowing in an hour, you'll lose half the herd to thirst or madness." "I'll take 3 men," Jedediah started. Crack! A gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. Dust kicked up inches from Jedediah's horse. "Cover!" Dutch yelled. Another shot rang out, then a volley. Bullets whizzed through the air, sending the cattle into a frenzy. The shots were coming from the ridge line, the high ground. Abby and Jedediah dove behind a cluster of boulders. Jedediah groaned as he landed on his bad arm, his face turning white. "You okay?" Abby asked, jacking around into her Winchester. "I'm fine," he gritted out. He pulled his revolver. "They have us pinned. They want to stampede the herd right over us." Abby peeked over the rock. She saw the glint of a rifle barrel in the rocks above. "They're using a Sharps rifle. Long range. They're picking off the drovers." She looked at the geography. She knew this canyon. She had played here as a child. "Jedediah," she said urgently, "there's a goat trail. Around the back of that ridge. It comes out right behind that sniper's nest. It's too steep. Not for me. Not on foot." "No," Jedediah grabbed her wrist. "I am not letting you go up there alone. You can't shoot with one arm, and you can't climb with it either." Abby pulled her hand free. Her eyes were fierce. "You hold their attention. Keep them firing at this rock. I'm going to flank them. Abigail. Trust me. Husband." She didn't wait for his answer. She slipped backward into the brush, moving low and fast like a coyote. Abby climbed. Her lungs burned, and her boots slipped on the loose shale, but she didn't stop. She could hear the rhythmic crack-boom of the exchange below. Jedediah was drawing their fire, exposing himself to keep them focused downhill. She reached the crest of the ridge 20 minutes later. She was behind the ambush point. She crept forward, her rifle ready. There were 3 men. They were lying prone, firing down into the herd. 2 were strangers, hired guns in dusters. But the third man, the one giving orders, Abby froze. It was Jeremiah Holt, the blacksmith, the man who had led the mob to defend her honor just days ago. "Keep firing," Holt yelled. "Make those cows run. I want Rourke buried under beef." Abby felt a wave of nausea. Holt wasn't doing this for the town. He wasn't doing this for Samuel. He was doing it for money. The Chicago syndicate hadn't just bought the sheriff. They had bought her neighbor. She stepped out from behind the rock, leveling her rifle at Holt's back. "Drop it, Jeremiah!" she screamed. The 3 men spun around. The 2 hired guns hesitated, seeing a woman. But Holt's eyes went wide, then narrowed into a snarl. "Abby, get out of here, girl. This ain't your business. You're shooting at my husband. You're shooting at my herd. It ain't your herd. It's his." Holt raised his rifle toward her. "I told you, Abby, you shouldn't have married him. You picked the wrong side." "Jeremiah, don't. Put the gun down, Abby. I don't want to hurt you, but I've got $5,000 waiting for me if this herd doesn't make the train." $5,000. A fortune. Enough to buy a soul. "You're a traitor!" she spat. "I'm a survivor!" Holt yelled. He swung the rifle barrel toward her chest. Abby didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She squeezed the trigger. Bang! The recoil slammed into her shoulder. Holt jerked backward, his rifle discharging into the sky. He crumbled to the ground, clutching his leg. The two hired guns looked at Holt, then at Abby, who had already levered another round and had the barrel pointed between them. "Go!" she screamed. "Run, or the next one is in your teeth." They didn't argue. They weren't paid enough to die. They scrambled down the back side of the ridge, leaving Holt writhing in the dirt. Abby walked over to the blacksmith. He was groaning, blood seeping through his trousers. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't fighting anymore. She looked down into the canyon. The shooting had stopped. Jedediah was standing up, looking toward the ridge, fear etched on his face. Abby took off her hat and waved it, a signal. Safe. She saw Jedediah slump against the boulder, his relief visible even from this distance. 10 minutes later, Jedediah and Dutch reached the ridge. They secured Holt and quickly moved to break the makeshift dam of rocks and logs the men had built. As the water roared back into the creek bed, cascading down to the thirsty cattle below, Jedediah walked over to Abby. She was sitting on a rock, shaking. The adrenaline was crashing. She had just shot a man she had known since childhood. Jedediah didn't say a word. He wrapped his good arm around her and pulled her into his chest. He held her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I got him," she sobbed into his ruined shirt. "It was Jeremiah." "I know," Jedediah whispered. "I know. You did good, Abby. You saved us. You saved everything." He said I picked the wrong side. Jedediah pulled back, lifting her chin with his hand, so she had to look at him. His blue eyes were fierce, filled with an emotion that went far beyond gratitude. "You picked the winning side, Abigail, because I am never letting anyone hurt you again." He kissed her then. It wasn't gentle at all. It was desperate tasting of dust and gunpowder and survival. And for the first time in 3 years, amidst the chaos and the danger, Abigail Coulter didn't feel alone. She felt invincible. But the war wasn't over. They had stopped the ambush, but the man who paid for it, the man in Chicago and his puppet master in town, was still out there. And they still had to get 3,000 cows to the train before the deadline. "Let's move the herd," Abby said, pulling away, wiping her eyes. "We have a train to catch." On the afternoon of September 30th, just hours before the deadline, Abigail and Jedediah drove 3,000 head of cattle over the final ridge above the Cheyenne railhead. They were exhausted, caked in dust and running on sheer willpower, but the sight of the Union Pacific steam engine puffing smoke below was a victory in itself. "We made it," Jedediah rasped, his voice hoarse. "They're here." "Don't celebrate yet," Abby warned, spotting 3 figures standing on the loading platform. "The vultures are waiting." They rode down to the pens where Mr. Blackwood, the representative for the Chicago Beef Trust, stood waiting with a pocket watch. Next to him, leaning smugly against a post, was Sheriff Elias Cobb. "Mr. Rourke," Blackwood said, snapping his watch shut. "You cut it fine, but I'm afraid I can't accept these cattle. There is a pending investigation regarding your operations." "What investigation?" Jedediah demanded, his hand drifting toward his gun. "That would be my department," Sheriff Cobb drawled, stepping forward. "I have a warrant for your arrest, Rourke, for the attempted murder of Jeremiah Holt." "Attempted murder?" Abby cried. "Holt ambushed us." "That's not what Jeremiah says," Cobb smirked. "He claims you two rode him down in cold blood. Mr. Blackwood can't do business with a criminal. The contract is void." It was a trap. They had survived the fire and the drought only to be beaten by a lie. Jedediah looked devastated, but Abby simply looked furious. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. "You want to talk about the law, Sheriff?" Abby asked, her voice ringing out. "This is Jeremiah Holt's personal ledger. He's a meticulous man. He records everything." She opened the book, pretending to read. "Here's an entry from last week, $500. Deposit from E. Cobb. Job burn the barn." Cobb went pale. Abby flipped a page. "August 12th, $200. From Blackwood. Job dam the creek." She slammed the book shut. "Interfering with the supply of food to the U.S. Army is federal treason, Mr. Blackwood. I can hand this ledger to the U.S. Marshal, or you can weigh these cows." Blackwood, terrified of a federal hanging charge, turned on Cobb instantly. "I have no knowledge of this man's actions. Weigh the herd." "Get them on the cars." Cobb, realizing he was alone and exposed, didn't say a word. He mounted his horse and galloped away toward the border, never to be seen in Silver Creek again. As the cattle were loaded, Abby handed the book to Jedediah. "You really found that on Holt?" Jedediah asked in awe. Abby smiled mischievously. "Actually, it's just his sketchbook. He likes to draw birds. I made the rest up." Jedediah stared at her, then threw his head back and laughed a sound of pure joy. He spun her around on the platform. "Abigail Rourke, you are the most dangerous woman in Wyoming." They returned to Silver Creek as conquerors. The check cleared, the debt was paid, and the town hailed them as heroes who saved the local economy. That night, standing on the porch of the ranch house, the air was peaceful. The creek bubbled nearby, finally flowing free. "The contract is fulfilled," Abby said softly. "The debt is gone. According to our agreement, we can dissolve this marriage now." Jedediah went still. He stepped closer, taking her hand. "Is that what you want?" Abby looked at the man who had walked into fire for her horses and fought an army for her land. "I don't know. The ranch is hard to run alone." "I'm a good worker," Jedediah whispered, pulling her close. "And I don't want the land without you. I don't want anything without you." He kissed her, then a deep, claiming kiss that sealed a bond stronger than any legal paper. When they broke apart, Jedediah smiled, that wicked glint returning to his eyes. "So," he whispered, holding up a small iron object. "You want to put it in?" Abby laughed, recognizing the callback to the scream that started it all. "Put what in? The key," he said, pressing the front door key into her palm. "To our house?" "Yes," she said, closing her hand over his. "I believe I do." So the scream that outraged a town became the spark that saved it. Jedediah Rourke and Abigail Coulter proved that in the Wild West, the strongest fences aren't made of barbed wire. They're made of trust, grit, and a little bit of well-timed deception. Their legacy in Silver Creek wasn't the water they fought over, but the love they fought for. It just goes to show that sometimes the person you think is your worst enemy is actually the only one who can help you survive the storm. If you enjoyed this story of romance, rivalry, and redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good Western drama. And subscribe for more incredible, true-to-life stories from the pages of history. Thanks for watching.